Canada, a land of breathtaking landscapes, diverse cultures, and rich traditions. But behind its peaceful reputation lies a fascinating history shaped by indigenous civilizations, European colonization, struggles for independence, and global influence. In this video, we'll explore the incredible journey of how Canada became the nation it is today. Whether you're a history lover, a curious learner, or simply interested in the roots of this great country, this story will open your eyes to the events, people, and moments that defined Canada. Let's dive into the true story behind the maple leaf. Long before European explorers set foot on the land now known as Canada, it was home to rich, complex civilizations formed by indigenous peoples. The First Nations, Inuit, and later the Métis are the original inhabitants of Canada, and their history stretches back over 12,000 years. Understanding their role is essential for appreciating the true foundation of Canadian history. The First Nations were spread across the vast landscape, from the coastal rainforests of British Columbia to the woodlands of Ontario and the plains of the prairies. Each group had its own culture, language, and societal structure. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy in the east, for instance, developed a sophisticated democratic system, often called one of the oldest participatory democracies in the world. Meanwhile, in the west, the Nuu-chah-nulth peoples thrived through ocean-based economies, mastering whaling and canoe-building techniques passed down through generations. In the far north, the Inuit communities adapted brilliantly to life in the Arctic, using tools made from bones and stones, and constructing igloos in winter. They built societies based on cooperation and survival in one of the planet's harshest climates. Their spiritual beliefs, rich storytelling traditions, and respect for nature reveal a deep connection to their environment that continues to influence Canadian thought and values today. Later, during the colonial period, the Métis people emerged from the intermarriage between European fur traders and indigenous women. The Métis developed their own distinct culture, language, michif, and identity, playing a key role in trade and resistance movements, particularly in Western Canada. Indigenous societies were not primitive or static. They were dynamic, evolving, and deeply knowledgeable about the land. Through generations of observation and oral transmission, they developed sustainable farming, fishing, and hunting techniques. They built complex trade networks that stretched across the continent long before European contact. Items like shells, copper, and obsidian would be traded between nations, sometimes over thousands of kilometers. Spirituality and community life were central to indigenous cultures. Most indigenous belief systems were grounded in a deep respect for nature and a sense of interconnectedness between humans, animals, and the land. Ceremonies, songs, dances, and stories carried sacred meanings and served to preserve their cultures across centuries. However, the arrival of European settlers had a devastating impact. Disease, displacement, and assimilation policies, including the residential school system, aimed to erase indigenous cultures. These acts caused deep trauma and injustice, the effects of which are still felt today. Despite this, indigenous peoples have shown immense strength and resilience. Their languages are being revitalized, traditional knowledge is being shared, and they continue to lead in areas like environmental protection, art, and education. In recent years, Canada has taken steps to acknowledge these historical wrongs. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, launched in 2008, documented the experiences of residential school survivors, and issued 94 calls to action to redress the legacy of residential schools and advance reconciliation. While progress is ongoing, it marks a turning point in how Canadians view their history. In conclusion, the Indigenous peoples of Canada are not just a chapter in the past, they are a living, vibrant part of the nation's story. Their contributions, cultures, and voices must be central to any honest exploration of Canadian history. To understand Canada, one must first understand and respect the civilizations that laid its original foundations. The history of Canada took a dramatic turn with the arrival of European explorers in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. These early voyages, driven by the desire for new trade routes and resources, marked the beginning of a long era of exploration, colonization, and cultural transformation. One of the earliest recorded European contacts was by John Cabot, an Italian explorer sailing under the English flag, who landed on the eastern shores of what is now Canada in 1497. However, it was the French explorer Jacques Cartier who made a more lasting impact when he journeyed up the St. Lawrence River in 1534. Cartier's exploration laid the groundwork for French claims to the region, especially in what became New France. During the 1600s, French settlers began to establish colonies along the St. Lawrence River, most notably in Quebec City 1608, founded by Samuel de Champlain, often considered the father of New France. The French were primarily focused on the fur trade, which became the economic backbone of their colonization efforts. They built extensive trade networks with indigenous peoples, particularly the Huron, Wendat, exchanging European goods for valuable beaver pelts. Meanwhile, the British were also staking claims in parts of eastern Canada, notably around Hudson Bay and later in areas that would become the 13 colonies to the south. The Hudson's Bay Company, founded in 1670, became a powerful commercial enterprise that controlled vast regions of the interior through trade and exploration. The competition between France and Britain intensified throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, and both empires used alliances with indigenous nations to strengthen their positions. However, these alliances also drew indigenous peoples into European conflicts, disrupting traditional territories and political structures. The growing rivalry culminated in the 7 Years' War 1756-1763, a global conflict with significant consequences for North America. The war ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, in which France ceded almost all of its North American territories to Britain. This event drastically altered the political and cultural landscape of Canada as French-speaking settlers found themselves under British rule. Despite the loss of political power, French culture and language remained strong, especially in Quebec, where French laws, religion, and traditions continued to thrive. This unique blend of French and British colonial influences set the stage for Canada's bilingual and bicultural identity. Colonization, however, came at a heavy cost to indigenous peoples. European diseases such as smallpox decimated populations, while settler expansion disrupted traditional territories, hunting grounds, and spiritual lands. The introduction of European goods and weapons also altered indigenous economies and intertribal relations in profound ways. In conclusion, European exploration and colonization introduced lasting changes to the land now known as Canada. It brought new languages, religions, and governance systems, while also initiating centuries of cultural conflict, cooperation, and change. These early colonial encounters are a critical part of Canada's history and continue to influence the country's identity today. One of the most defining chapters in the history of Canada is the long-standing rivalry between France and Britain. This geopolitical struggle not only shaped the borders and power structures in North America, but also laid the cultural and linguistic foundations that continue to influence Canada to this day. The conflict began in earnest in the 17th century as both France and Britain sought to expand their global empires. In North America, France had established New France, stretching from the Gulf of St. Lawrence down to Louisiana, at its height, New France included areas that are now parts of modern-day Canada and the United States. Meanwhile, Britain was focused on its Atlantic colonies along the east coast, including areas like Newfoundland and Rupert's Land controlled by the Hudson's Bay Company. The two European powers were not only competing for land, but also for control over the lucrative fur trade. Both nations formed strategic alliances with indigenous nations to gain an advantage. The French aligned with groups like the Huron, Wendat, and Algonquin, while the British often partnered with the Haudenosaunee-Iroquois Confederacy. These alliances were not merely symbolic, they often involved military support, shared trading networks, and mutual defense agreements. This escalating tension led to a series of intercolonial wars that mirrored broader conflicts in Europe. Among the most significant was the French and Indian War 1754-1763, the North American front of the global 7 Years' War. This war would prove decisive for Canada's future. The British, with their superior naval power and growing colonial populations, eventually overpowered the French. A critical moment came in 1759, during the Battle of the Plains of Abraham near Quebec City. British forces under General James Wolfe defeated French troops led by General Montcalm in a short but pivotal battle. Both commanders died in the fight, but the British gained control of Quebec, a symbolic and strategic victory. The war officially ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, in which France ceded nearly all its territories in North America to Britain. While France retained a few small islands like St. Pierre and Miquelon, British control over Canada was now firmly established. However, this victory presented new challenges for the British. They now ruled over a large population of French-speaking Catholics who had their own laws, customs, and identity. Rather than force assimilation, the British passed the Quebec Act of 1774, which allowed French Canadians to keep their civil law, language, and religion. This act helped maintain peace in the colony, but also laid the foundation for Canada's bilingual and bicultural nature. The rivalry didn't end entirely with the treaty. It lived on in Canadian identity and governance. The British continued expanding westward, often clashing with indigenous groups and the emerging Métis population. Meanwhile, French Canadians remained a distinct community, often marginalized politically, but resilient in preserving their culture. The legacy of the French and British rivalry is still visible today. Canada is officially bilingual, with English and French as its two official languages. Quebec remains a predominantly French-speaking province with a strong cultural identity, and debates over autonomy and independence have shaped Canadian politics for decades. In summary, the battle between France and Britain over Canadian territory was more than a military contest. It was a struggle that determined the cultural DNA of the nation. The outcome created a dual heritage that remains central to understanding Canada's identity, governance, and societal values even in the 21st century. The creation of modern Canada didn't happen overnight. It was the result of decades of negotiation, political vision, regional struggles, and a growing desire among British colonies in North America to unite for strength and survival. This journey toward unity culminated in Confederation on July 1, 1867, when Canada officially became a self-governing dominion under the British Crown. But the road to Confederation was anything but simple. It was paved with economic concerns, external threats, and the ambition of visionary leaders. In the mid-1800s, British North America was made up of several colonies, including Canada West, now Ontario, Canada East, now Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island, among others. These regions operated mostly independently and had their own local governments, economies, and transportation systems. However, several challenges began to push them toward unity. One of the biggest drivers was political deadlock, especially in the province of Canada West and East, where English and French legislators often disagreed and struggled to pass laws. Leaders from both sides began to realize that a new federal structure could allow different provinces to maintain local control while working together on national issues like defense and trade. Economic motivations also played a major role. The colonies wanted to create a unified internal market to reduce reliance on trade with the United States and Britain, especially after the American Civil War and the cancellation of the Reciprocity Treaty in 1866. A union promised better infrastructure, like railways, to connect distant provinces and promote commerce. Meanwhile, external threats further encouraged unity. The fear of American expansionism loomed large. After the U.S. Civil War, American attitudes toward Britain soured, and some Canadians feared a potential invasion or annexation. Uniting would strengthen their defense and make British North America more stable in the eyes of the British government, which was also keen on reducing its financial responsibility for its colonies. The push for Confederation was led by a group of politicians now known as the Fathers of Confederation, including Sir John A. Macdonald, George Etienne Cartier, George Brown, and others. These leaders envisioned a strong federal government balanced with provincial rights to ensure cooperation and stability. They met at a series of conferences, including the Charlottetown Conference 1864 and the Quebec Conference, where they debated and drafted the foundational ideas of what would become the new country. Finally, on July 1, 1867, the British North America Act, now called the Constitution Act, was passed by the British Parliament, uniting Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia into a new nation, the Dominion of Canada. This day is now celebrated every year as Canada Day. The Act established Canada as a self-governing entity within the British Empire, with a federal structure that divided powers between the central government and the provinces. Sir John A. Macdonald became Canada's first Prime Minister, and Ottawa was chosen as the capital. In the years that followed, other provinces and territories joined the Confederation. Manitoba and the Northwest Territories in 1870, British Columbia in 1871, Prince Edward Island in 1873, and eventually Newfoundland and Labrador in 1949. This gradual expansion helped shape the country's geography and national identity. In conclusion, Confederation was a landmark event in Canadian history, marking the birth of a new nation built on cooperation, compromise, and the belief in unity through diversity. Though challenges remained, especially regarding Indigenous rights and regional differences, the foundation was laid for Canada to evolve into the peaceful and pluralistic country it is today. Following Confederation in 1867, Canada embarked on a journey of nation building that would gradually transform it from a British colony into a fully independent and globally recognized country. This period, spanning the late 19th and 20th centuries, saw massive changes in Canada's size, economy, population, global role, and national identity. It was also a time of growing challenges and internal conflicts, but through it all, Canada continued to shape itself into the country we know today. One of the first major steps in nation building was geographical expansion. The original Confederation included just 4 provinces, but Canada's territory would grow quickly. The purchase of Rupert's Land and the Northwestern Territory from the Hudson's Bay Company in 1008 170 added vast land to the west. Soon after, new provinces and territories were formed. Manitoba 1870, British Columbia 1,871, Prince Edward Island 1,873, Alberta and Saskatchewan 1905, and Newfoundland and Labrador much later in 1949, the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut created in 1999 also shaped Canada's northern presence. To connect this sprawling country, one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects was launched, the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway. Completed in 1885, it linked eastern and western Canada, enabling trade, migration, military transport, and national unity. It also symbolized Canada's determination to exist as a unified coast-to-coast country. However, this expansion was not without controversy. The railway and western settlement severely disrupted the lives of Indigenous peoples, displacing communities and leading to broken treaties. Additionally, Canada's Métis population, led by Louis Riel, resisted the encroachment on their lands and rights. The two Métis uprisings, Red River in 1869 and Northwest Rebellion in 1885, were pivotal events that highlighted ongoing struggles for recognition and justice issues that are still central in Canada's reconciliation efforts today. As Canada grew internally, it also began to play a larger role on the world stage. During World War I 1914-1918, Canada fought as part of the British Empire, but with great distinction, most notably at battles like Vimy Ridge in 1917. The bravery and sacrifices of Canadian soldiers earned Canada international respect and helped foster a sense of national pride and autonomy. This trend continued through World War II, 1939-1945. Unlike WWI, Canada declared war on Germany independently from Britain, signaling a clear step towards sovereignty. Canadian forces fought in major battles such as the Battle of the Atlantic, Deep, and D-Day, and played a significant role in the liberation of Europe. In peacetime, Canada became known for its peacekeeping missions, diplomacy, and support for international institutions like the United Nations and the Commonwealth. Leaders such as Lester B. Pearson, who won a Nobel Peace Prize in 1957 for resolving the Suez Crisis, reinforced Canada's image as a peaceful and principled nation. The final legal steps toward full independence came in 1982 when the Constitution Act was passed. This historic event, known as the patriation of the Constitution, meant that Canada could now amend its own constitution without approval from Britain. It also included the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, a document that guarantees fundamental rights and freedoms for all Canadians and has become a cornerstone of the country's legal and political identity. In conclusion, Canada's journey of nation building and independence was long and complex, involving triumphs, struggles, and compromises. It brought together a vast land, diverse peoples, and a shared vision of democracy and freedom. Although the country continues to face challenges, especially regarding Indigenous rights and regional divisions, its evolution into a sovereign, multicultural, and globally respected nation remains one of the most remarkable stories in modern history. Modern Canada is often celebrated as a peaceful, progressive, and multicultural nation with a high quality of life, strong democratic values, and a reputation for global peacekeeping and diplomacy. Canada stands as a symbol of tolerance and inclusion. However, beneath this admired image lies a complex and often painful history, particularly in its relationship with Indigenous peoples. In recent decades, reconciliation has become a central focus in the national conversation, marking a critical phase in Canada's evolving identity. Today, Canada is home to more than 40 million people, representing a mosaic of cultures, religions, and ethnic backgrounds. From large immigrant communities in cities like Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal to vibrant Francophone and Indigenous populations, Canada's diversity is one of its greatest strengths. It is officially bilingual English and French and recognizes multiculturalism as a core national value, even enshrining it in law through the Multiculturalism Act of 1988. However, for many Indigenous communities, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, the promise of equality and respect has long been undermined by centuries of colonization, displacement, and systemic injustice. One of the darkest chapters in Canadian history is the residential school system, which operated from the late 1800s until the 1990s. These government-funded church-run institutions were designed to assimilate Indigenous children by forcibly removing them from their families and cultures. Over 150 Indigenous children were affected, many suffering emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. Thousands never returned home. In 2008, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada TRC was established to investigate and document the experiences of survivors. Over several years, the TRC collected thousands of testimonies and in 2015 released its final report. This included 94 calls to action-specific steps aimed at repairing the harm caused by residential schools and promoting genuine reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. Reconciliation is not just a legal or political process. It's a moral and cultural responsibility. It involves acknowledging the truth of the past, addressing ongoing inequalities, and creating space for Indigenous voices, rights, and leadership in all areas of Canadian life. This includes land rights, language preservation, education reform, and access to health care and clean water, issues where many Indigenous communities still face significant challenges today. Canadian society has responded in many ways. Orange Shirt Day on September 30, now recognized as the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, honors residential school survivors and promotes education about their experiences. Museums, schools, universities, and government institutions are increasingly including Indigenous perspectives in their programming and policies. Indigenous artists, activists, and leaders are also gaining wider recognition, helping reshape Canadian culture from the ground up. At the same time, modern Canada continues to face new challenges. Climate change, housing affordability, immigration debates, and political divisions all test the country's values and unity. Yet, Canada's institutions remain relatively strong, and its democratic culture has shown resilience. Its healthcare system, public education, and social safety nets are seen globally as models of inclusive governance. Importantly, reconciliation is not an endpoint, it's an ongoing process. Many Indigenous communities are reclaiming their languages, traditions, and governance systems, building strength through cultural revival and self-determination. The broader Canadian public is also becoming more aware of historical injustices, leading to a growing national commitment to justice and equity. In conclusion, modern Canada is a country in transformation, still reckoning with its past, but striving to build a future rooted in respect, inclusion, and shared responsibility. Understanding the truth and working toward reconciliation is not just essential for healing, it's the foundation for a stronger, more united Canada.